Глубоко уважаемые коллеги, дамы и господа.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let us start. We will try to be more dynamic in our progress. My name is Evgeny Gashol. I'm professor of Moscow Energy Institute and chairman of the Commission on Environment in the Public Civic Chamber of Moscow. So we have our guest here, Jonathan Perks, principal consultant from Recording Energy and Environment UK, who will be co-moderator. Then we have Reinhard Albert, German Environmental Protection Agency and expert of the German-Russian project Climate-Friendly Economic Activities. Then August Regina, head of the Department for Industrial Ecology and Life Safety, St. Petersburg. Galina Tukhina, Executive Director of Kazakhstan Association of Nature Users for Sustainable Development. Mikhail Gitarsky, one of the leading experts from the Global Climate and Ecology Institute. Andro, Executive Director on Climate and the Parisian Agency. And, well, I think I didn't miss anyone. So my dear colleague, my co-moderator, Jonathan Perks, maybe you want to say a couple words to maybe state some tasks for the session. Okay.
Come across, I think, in some of the previous themes. It's about is that working?
Yes.
So I think that from my perspective, it is useful to learn from the lessons of other cities and other organisations. And so I hope that the one thing that we can do in this session is to try and learn some of those lessons, share the best practices, maybe not share some of the things that have gone wrong, so that we can then make step changes to reducing emissions and improving energy efficiency in Moscow and in the other cities that are represented here this week.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perks. And we'll first invite Ms. Giraud to tell us about the priorities that the national agency states. It's very interesting because France is such an industrial country. Because it's very important to listen to this international experience and to your experience personally. Okay, so sorry, we have a bit of confusion. So, Mr. Perks, your presentation will go first. So please put the presentation on.
Ricardo. We are an environmental consultancy organisation. We've been in this business for very many years, and we started work in this area over 60 years ago by creating policy in the UK for the Clean Air Acts, which resolve the smogs that were in London in the 1950s. We have we've been working with the government in setting policies on environmental issues for that long. More recently, we've been working a lot with very many cities through programs like C40, 100 Resilient Cities, and also EBRD in their regions of operation. And we're working currently with the Research Institute Environmental Industrial Policy Centre for the Foreign Office here, the Embassy, in developing and testing energy efficiency instruments, promoting corporate climate leadership in selected industrial sectors. And the focus of this work will be in the food and drink processing sector, which I think is important to Moscow, particularly since I gather you have a vodka distillery within the city regions. So being kind of one of the front runners in all of this, I think the UK has just about tried every policy measure, tax, incentive that could be applied to reducing industrial emissions. So these include tax, which was the climate change levy, which essentially applies to all businesses and public sector users of energy, and the rates of those taxes are dependent upon the energy usage, so be it electricity, natural gas, LPG or other things. And that tax is reviewed annually as part of the budgetary process, and it's set to provide an incentive to save energy. I won't say a lot more about it than that, except to say that most industries don't like taxes. And so there have been then a number of other measures which have been developed to lessen the impact of the direct tax, but also to maintain incentives for energy efficiency measures. While none of them actually were specific to the food and drink sector, they've all impacted on the processing sector there. So let me just say something then about the food and drink sector. I suppose the main things about this are that there has been a continuous use in electricity consumption because of automation, process control, and the growth in processed foods and chilled foods that are sold in retailers, and certainly people in the UK have become more accustomed to. Although energy presents a low proportion of the cost of the total production costs, it's still important in terms of a very dynamic and a highly competitive industry. The industry is driven by consumers and retail demands, and that one of those demands is very much on cost reduction as part of the individual's fuel bill. But one also has to comment that safety and quality is also absolutely paramount importance in this industry. So there's a constant pressure on product innovation, product differentiation, and reducing costs. And of course, as part of that, energy efficiency is seen as very important. It has to be said, though, that carbon decarbonisation is not considered as important in the same way that energy efficiency is, I suppose because it doesn't affect the profit margins in the industry. Which I think is a very important point, because actually businesses are driven by money, they're driven by profit as well as reputation, and so things that also drive the profit will actually also be very useful in driving behaviour. So there were two measures that I particularly wanted to talk about in terms of how the carbon climate change levy has been softened, maybe in terms of a cost on industry, but while trying to keep the focus on improving energy efficiency. And the first one of these is in climate change agreements, which are actually voluntary agreements for energy efficient industries. But what they offer that the industries like is exemptions to the climate change levy, which can be up to 65% for gas and other combustion fuels, but up to 90% on electricity. So comply with the climate change levies and you can substantially reduce your tax bills. And each of there's 53 different sectors to which this is applied, and each have different reduction targets depending on the level of reductions that can be achieved in the various sectors. Clearly, heavy industry may be able to apply much larger savings than the service industry and maybe the food industry. So what companies have to do is to provide a commitment to energy savings, and then once they've made that commitment, they can claim a tax rebate, and then after that, after a 2-year period, the performance is reported, and then companies can either say that their target's been met, in which case they participate in the next round of the climate change agreement. If it's not, they can either buy out the fee paid, so they can continue, or they can stop participation in the scheme. Of course, this is good for consultants because all these things have to be audited, and Ricardo is involved in part of that auditing process as well as the policy setting. So, what lessons? Oh, I think I'm on the wrong slide. So, sorry. Let's get that. So the food and drink industry initially was not included actually in the climate change agreements, but because of industry lobbying, they were included as the threshold was increased and less energy intensive industries were included. They, as I said before, they have targets which are set for specific sectors, and I guess the other thing is that most of the sectors are consistently meeting their targets, but some sectors are not. And I guess there is a question there of where you set the targets and whether they're too soft, and whether we're just encouraging business as usual, which will be driven by the profit margin. So the lessons learned in this is that the tax burden was reduced for the industry over time. Actually, industries welcomed the scheme, and I guess the other important thing here that's sometimes lost is that this has provided now a database, an evidence base for the amounts of energy that's used in these industries, and the sorts of energy savings which can be achieved. So that, I think, is an important thing in itself in being able to measure the improvements. So the next scheme that I want to talk about is the carbon reduction commitment, which was launched in just 8 years ago, and this was specifically designed to address large but not very intensive industries. It was designed to be revenue neutral, but again, one of the things that, but what it did do was to provide league tables of energy performance. So again, this is about collecting information on energy consumption, submitting it to the government, purchasing allowances for those emissions, and then surrendering allowances. So it's a kind of a credit scheme. I think this scheme will be terminated next year, just because it's too complicated. And I think that's one of the other lessons that we can learn from here. We need to go for simplicity rather than complexity. But again, it provided many companies for the first time to collect information on their energy consumption and therefore where their energy savings could be met. And this has enabled future policy to be consistent and simple as it is approached in the future. So if I come back to my original slide, you can see that from a vast array of original legislation and rules, these are gradually being narrowed down to just 2 or 3, where the focus is on actually beginning to have a more coordinated approach where the taxes and the reporting are pulled together. So where are we going next in all of this? I suppose the first thing to note is that these things have probably been effective in that while the food and drink sector grew by almost 20% through from 1990 to 2015, it's actually lowered its carbon footprint by 42% since by that end year. So the question then is, how can we continue to maintain that level of improvement? And as part of that process, the government is setting out industrial decarbonisation, energy efficiency roadmaps for each of the industries, while emissions have gone down 42%. So a clean economy is good not only for carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, it's also about energy security, it's about creating jobs, and it's about realising exports. And in the UK, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but the green economy is by far the fastest growing economy sector in the UK. So there are lots, I think, of co-benefits as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Your question is very important, and we will answer it. We will be answering throughout the remaining hour. Thank you for the consistency of your policy and for a certain integrity. Indeed, the effect is quite significant. Now, to German experience, Mr. Albert, we spoke already how the new generation of BREF's reference documents are set up. Unfortunately, we have quite little time. And while your presentation is being prepared, please allow me to put in one sentence. Some 10 years ago, we translated the European reference book, and people were surprised to see that apart from information, there was a lot to do with the management and with the people, which is in fact a very important aspect. So please.
Presentation with the direction also for reducing energy in cities and municipalities, and not only reducing energy consumption of industry, but I presented, as you can read, the best available technique reference document on energy efficiency, which is a European Union process, and meanwhile, in Europe we have 33 BREF documents, and most of them are process specific to give information and to make obligations that industry uses the best available technique for the different production processes. And there also exist some cross-cutting BREFs, and I want to tell you something about the reference document on energy efficiency. One important point at the process-specific BREFs is that they have to be taken into national law, and what belongs emissions to air and water especially, I believe brings environment improvement in Europe. But what belongs energy efficiency, these BREFs, the values are not obligating because it is difficult, because the installations are not all the same, and therefore there are ranges for specific energy consumption. And now I come to the BREF energy efficiency. This BREF has a character of an explanatory note and gives information for permit authorities, plant operators and other interested ones about the best available techniques for cross-sectional techniques. For example, in nearly all industrial installations you have electric motors, you have compressed air, you have lighting, you have combined heat and power, and energy efficiency methods like energy management, energy audit, and energy benchmarking. And these topics are all in the BREF. But disadvantage of this BREF is that it was published in 2009, and that means it is antiquated, and therefore in Germany we decided to make a national update to give the permit authorities and interested persons actual information. And what belongs this meeting, improving climate situation for cities, I believe this BREF is also interesting for municipalities, because these named cross-cutting technologies are in many municipality installations like waterworks, street lighting, and so on. Air conditioning, and therefore it is a guide document, and it can help to get actual information on these energy efficiency technologies. And especially I want to come to one topic that is important for industry to improve energy efficiency and also can help the cities to reduce its energy consumption, and that's waste heat usage. In the EU Industry Emissions Directive, Article 11 says that energy is efficient to use, and waste heat usage is one possibility to do this. And there exist some assessments for Germany that show that's a big potential of waste heat usage, means about 88 to 125 terawatt hours. And this energy corresponds to the whole energy used in Germany for district heating. This also means that much waste heat is still now in Germany is not used. And therefore, 1 year ago, a funding program was started to make it easier for companies to invest in measures to recover or avoid waste heat. But a very important point for industry is, before using waste heat, it should be tried to minimize the discharge of waste heat. Following, I have still some remarks to reach energy efficiency that are also guilty for state municipalities. What means, for example, small and medium enterprises often do not have enough finances to realize energy efficiency measures. It can be said the first thing should be to realize energy efficiency measures that have a good return of investment. And nearly always there exist, especially at SMEs, such possibilities. And what's also important for industrial installations, also as for municipality installations, is to make an audit, or better to install an energy management system to get the data of the installation, because if you do not know your specific energy consumption and the situation, you cannot decide and realize what and how energy efficiency can be improved. And still some remarks. You can say we all know this, but often these remarks are not realized. It's very important to create consciousness of energy efficiency, for example, by information. And what is also important, energy efficiency measures often have a very good return on investment. If you have in industry end-of-pipe measures, there seldom is a good return on investment. Therefore, that's the good thing on energy efficiency measures. You can reduce the energy consumption and earn money. For example, if you replace a a high-efficient electric motor that works about 4,000 hours a year. He is refinanced after 2 years, and then you earn money. And to use this BREF energy efficiency, it's all important for cities, and for example, because the cross-cutting technologies are in the cities, what means heat and electricity supply, lighting, traffic, waste water management, water supply and distribution. In all these areas, the energy efficiency also in cities can be improved. That's the end, but I would still like to give some additional remarks after the representation of the colleague from UK. I believe this system that he declared is very good to reduce industrial CO2 emissions, and in Germany there are also meanwhile a lot of funding programs to improve energy efficiency in industry, but in the past especially great companies often don't realize energy efficiency measures that have a better return on investment than 2 years. And that's a difficult thing, because after 2 years of realization of this measure, they earn money. Yes, that's all what I want to say.
Сердечно благодарю вас, господин.
We thank you with all our heart, Mr. Albert, for the opportunity to learn new experience. Now let us throw the baton to the Russian colleague, Mr. Krivtsov. Now the presentation will be prepared. The presentation by Krivtsov, and the remote you can ask from Mr. Albert. In Russia, an organization on best available techniques was created. So further integration is assigned to the Center of Economic Policy, and Mr. Krivtsov heads the Department of Standardization of Technology of that center. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to say that May's decrees of the President of the Russian Federation made in the current year were aimed, among everything else, to the fact that the main industrial sectors of the Russian economy must carry out modernization of this technology, and they must be updated. And the scientific potential which is invested into this should also develop. That was linked with all main industries, especially one responsible for agricultural development. I'll say that this problem, which was voiced by Vladimir Putin, was not new for the Russian Federation, because, as you very well know, the implementation of the new technologies was carried out for a few recent years, until the adoption of the law of 2014 or 2015, and consequently the sub-laws were developed which defined the areas of application of the best available technologies, which defined the quantity and time for development of the reference guide on best available technologies, including the reference books on agricultural complex. I should mention that unlike the reference books developed in the EU, those developed in Russia were much greater in number. Russian Federation took its own way and developed separate reference books on the production of food products and production of beverages. Europe also had a single reference book on development of poultry and swine. In Russia, we came to have two different reference books. It was clear that those reference books must develop, and someone had to be in charge of that development, and this was supposed to be the Ministry of Agriculture. The ministry understood that 1 year allocated for developing of such reference books would not be enough to make this work properly. So even before those reference books had to be developed, the Ministry of Agriculture initiated this work. It took 1.5 years, so Russian Federation has 5 books of agricultural complex, and here, comparing with the European experience, the fact that the guidebooks on the best available technologies in accordance with the Russian legislation are developed for the best category. The European experience was borrowed from Europe, but we had our own specifics as well, as those reference guides were developed, and as to defining criteria why those guides are developed. So you can see here the criteria which was set by the Russian Federation and which were defined in our reference books on the best available technologies. It should be mentioned that the development of those reference books embraced a number of scientific representatives, those who were responsible for the work itself, commercial organizations, organizations producing agricultural equipment, and federal executive authorities. Each work group had many participants because the interest was big. Those groups might contain 60 to 80 people. Compared to other guidebooks on the best available technologies, these were quite numerous groups. Yet we managed to find consensus and develop the reference guides which everybody was happy with for the transition to the best available technologies. And these are the reference books which are now forming the basis for using new energy and for ensuring energy efficiency. In the current year, the Bureau of the Best Available Technologies, together with the Ricardo company, selected food industry as an industry which can be analyzed in terms of energy efficiency. As a facility for exploration, they chose our Moscow and the Moscow district, because it is in these areas there is about 1,000 enterprises responsible for production and processing of food products and beverages. Besides, for Moscow and the Moscow district, the input of it in the economy is some 25 to 30%. Given even the fact that food industry is quite energy-consuming production. Besides, every sphere of food industry applies technological solutions.
We've analyzed what there is in the BAT reference, and it transpired that the following processes have high energy saving potential. They are there in the slide. I want to enumerate them again. So these are the main processes that they have there in food and drink sector. Having analyzed the current situation, having analyzed what is available in the references, despite that we understood that there is a number of projects that are aimed at energy saving. The types of projects include modernized technological environment equipment, new refrigerators, etc. The question is, who will be in charge of modernizing the companies of the industry and those who produce the equipment for the industry? Will it be state support? Will it be the internal projects? So the references are developed, and best available technologies, energy-saving technologies, implementation becomes something common in the Russian Federation. We need to understand who the driver will be for the food industry, who make them take care of their energy consumption, who provide assistance to them to improve their competitive potential. That's it, and thank you. Okay, and now, Oleg, thank you very much. Thank you for introduction this area, and we'll ask Olga to tell us about specific leading companies of the food industry. See. There are a lot of people in Moscow, and there are a lot of people in St. Petersburg. So F&D companies and food delivery, and they're, well, and working with them takes a great share in the energy turnover. Yeah, we started thinking about all this, and yeah, it's quite a lot. So, Olga Nikolaevna, you're welcome. Yeah, I'll continue with this topical subject of the food industry. And today I'll tell you about those, and I'll also tell about those industries that were not included into BAT, something that's been mentioned by Oleg. But though they develop and they actively work in climate mitigation, I believe that a lot of things depend now on the companies themselves, because especially in big companies, in I'm talking about big companies and corporations where they have experts, where they have departments that are in charge of the development, and in these companies they pay a lot of attention to climatic changes. Why? The response to this question is lies in their corporate policies, where they analyze the external environment, and they analyze legislation risks, including climatic and energy risks that may affect the company activity. Unlike very advanced British and German experience, as you know, in Russia there are basically no incentives for the companies who are not part of the first category, hazardous companies. So no incentives in terms of introducing energy efficiency measure. And we don't have any taxes, extra taxes for CO2 emissions, well, in a form that they have, that was shared by our British colleagues. So whatever is being done based on their corporate policies. And in the slide, you can see those historical documents that are being used widely globally, and they're used in Russian F&D corporations who are leaders in the industry. And of course, ISO standards became Russian. These ISO standards became Russian standards, and they play a certain role in the process. But unfortunately, this differentiation that was mentioned by our British colleagues and informing the consumers that companies have such policies, well, we can see very few examples of that in Russia. For instance, carbon labeling. It's something that's not really known to the Russian consumer. But the historically important standard, this technical regulations on carbon on GHG emissions. Well, it's important for the industry because companies are take into account those emissions during the production stage, primary emissions, and other emissions. But international standards teach us to take to account for these emissions for the whole chain of the emissions, not only for direct emissions, but only for additional emissions, emissions used during producing the packaging, etc. And I was trying to find data on how F&D industry affects the general picture. Unfortunately, I managed to find only something in general, some very general ranking that was being developed by some American organization, I think. And interestingly, the refrigerants are very important in the sense for the industry. Of course, reduction of the food waste has its affection. Then solar energy, it also helps savings. Wind energy, well, it's more for St. Petersburg. Then biomass, heat pumps. This assessment was done covering the period to 2050. So what kind of savings should be done by food industry in general, or include food industry in our country, in order to decrease the potential emissions of greenhouse gases? So I won't be talking about SDGs. Clearly, here we have a lot of things related to fighting famine. UN SDGs are very important, but I want to draw your attention more to the more practical aspects, something that we observe in amongst the leaders of the food industry. We can see that together with environmental management, they start actively developing energy management. Unfortunately, it's not yet systemic. We see some random projects that are either pilot projects or initiatives that companies copy, but there is no proper management of such projects. Maybe it's connected with lack of information, lack of experience amongst companies' employees. But nonetheless, we see that we have such projects and initiatives, and it's something that's been already mentioned today. They mentioned today that a huge role is being played by the industrial buildings, more industrial facilities themselves, and there should be new technologies that should comply with BAT, but those companies that I'm talking about, they are not obliged to follow those. Resource efficiency is something of interest for those companies as well. Of course, they want to save on resources, including fuel resources and energy resources. Interestingly, you can see. Interestingly, there are certain examples. Well, this is an example of one drink producer, juice production company. It's resource intensive, water consumption intensive, etc., intensive, and there are certain production steps that involve consumption of a lot of water, etc., and they have to study those in detail. So here the universities can help the companies, and here you can see the calculations on specific energy efficiency projects and what kind of savings company can get if they save certain resources. Certain green columns stand for greenhouse gases reduction, and the curve that connects. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't notice that. I'm sorry for that. So these green columns, they stand for specific projects, energy efficiency projects. And the curve that connects them represents the profitability indices that can be received while implementing those projects. So the company sets the goals to change the scheme of using the resources, aiming at reducing the carbon footprint. And here we can see there are involved there. Costs per emission reduction unit in tons. So heat recuperation doesn't. They do not amount to considerable reduction in emissions, but they are quite profitable. And simple projects that are at the edge of rational use, they are not highly profitable, whereas projects that are connected with renewables and using and reusing heat, they give good reduction in emissions, but they are not profitable from the economical standpoint, and that was already mentioned today. Second example, this is a company that produces beer and non-alcoholic beverages. Also, it's quite in demand in St. Petersburg. And by the way, yeah, here you can see the comparison of different companies. And on the right, we have the data from the BREF reference document, European document for FDM. And if we take a look at the data per indicator, you can see that generally our company, which is one of the leaders of the industry, they comply with the requirements set in BREF. Also, they monitor CO2 emissions per hectoliter, and that's something that's not there in the European document. Well, I think that this is important in terms of informing and motivating the staff, and it's interesting for students of the universities and for staff of the universities. And sometimes we can get some interesting, unexpected results. Another example from the same company, the carbon footprint calculation at different stages. You need to take into account energy efficiency of each technology at each step of product creation. Well, brewery, well, it's energy intensive as it is, but If you take glass, for instance, glass bottles, cans, if you take PET bottles, or if you take kegs used in restaurants, here we can see that in this case that we can see that cans and bottles are most energy intensive, at least for now. Here on the right hand side you can see the waste of the industry, and this is very brewer spent grains. It's very energy intensive, and there was a suggestion to use it for biogas production. And from economical standpoint, this project is interesting, but it requires a lot of investment, and company doesn't have such funds to implement it fast. And to conclude, I would like to say that currently leaders of the food industry have strong corporate policy that includes consideration of environmental matters, and their policies are they include risk analysis, including the risks of prices for energy resources growing, different accidents, and therefore this industry is moving in the right direction. They are reducing the emissions step by step. I think the obstacles here, the main obstacles are lack of support and lack of motivation. Sometimes we need so-called negative motivation, I'd say. Well, the lack of reference books, I think it's an obstacle, but it doesn't have a great, this negative impact is not great, because companies, they are creating the references themselves, and we could share the information that we have, the assessments that we have, with the rest of the food industry and with those who are interested. Thank you. Are you ready? Okay. So please put on the presentation of Galina Artukina. There are heat pump people here in the audience. They introduce they carry out those projects in food industry. So you guys can talk. So, Galina Artukina's presentation, please. So, she'll share an experience of Kazakhstan, and we are very happy to see our guests from Kazakhstan. Even though we are really short of time, thank you for coming here, and thank you for your expo. There are people who've been there, and they're proud to have been there. Thank you for making sure that Kazakhstan is steadily following the modernizing trend. Thank you. Thank you very much, and I want to thank organizers for inviting us. Yes, this time we have come in a very representative manner, and I think this reflects the key thing about our today's life. We are getting back to tight collaboration with our colleagues in the Russian Federation. In particular, one of the key objectives of ours was to visit the Bureau of Best Available Technologies, because Kazakhstan today, this year is the 18th year when we are revising the environmental legislation. Kazakhstan is entering the third stage of improving the environment. And this stage is about modernizing the production. It's about transition to low carbon production, to using best available technologies, and it sets the government sets very important goals for business and for the community. Speaking of business, Kazakhstan also has experience in selling quotas for greenhouse gases. We have been using this scheme for 5 years. We are still learning, and business is getting very good at it now. We have certain share of free quotas for CO2, but there are also some things that businesses have to buy on the market mandatory.
We have implemented the system of reporting on the emissions of greenhouse gases and CO2 because Kazakhstan is export-oriented country and our product is a natural raw material which goes to the Western markets where this is a requirement from business. So in recent 10 years our business advanced a lot, but as a rule, this was done by own efforts without whatsoever support, financial or motivational, on the part of the government. But today, Kazakhstan poses very serious tasks on entering the top 30 competitive countries of the world. Today, we're entering the 50 list. So this position implies a very serious solution to environmental problems. And here the government will play a very serious role together with the business. Albeit our cities are not so big, not as big as Russia, but we still face some very serious challenges in the area of energy efficiency, because Kazakhstan, in fact, all the generation we have is that based on coal. So the coal track can be seen in almost every sphere of our life. So when the government sets the task of making the next step, the question arises of how much it's going to cost, because whatever measures could be taken with the federal budget and municipal budget, that was done or that's being done, such as replacement of city illumination or start of modernization of transport systems. But next we have to define the costs. We do understand that implementation of such tasks is not a cheap project. So the first ones who made such estimate, yes, and I'd like to say that we are discussing here the adjustment to climate change, but in fact Kazakhstan is the country which lives in the conditions of climate crises, because our winters are -35, -45, and summers are plus 35, plus 45 degrees Celsius. This is the temperatures range in which the economy of our country exists. So, on the example of two cities, two capitals, Astana, current capital, and Almaty, the previous capital, the estimate was made on energy efficiency of the cities. Why were these cities taken? Because Almaty is an example of old city with a traditional system of heating and power supply, and Astana as a new city where all infrastructural goals and objectives are implemented in a special way. Astana, in just 20 years, from the city with 300,000 population, became a million city, and it's going to grow to 2 million city. So this is a city which is developed very, very quickly, incredibly, and the pace is such that infrastructure, and in particular heat supply, is built with a lag. That is, buildings are ready and people start living in them, but the questions of heating are solved through local stations. So, the estimate which was made on energy efficiency of such cities In 2017, this project was implemented with the help of the experts from the World Bank and the Asian Bank of Development, because Kazakhstan and the Kazakh cities are viewed as objects with a high energy efficiency potential and increasing energy efficiency. So 2 reports were published on the plans of raising energy efficiency of the 2 cities. This was the first time one such step-by-step analysis was made with determining priorities, so that money was invested today not just in implementation of some obscure projects, but to have it clear-cut and balanced with the prioritization of industry sectors. So for municipal sector, 10 sectors were defined, with almost each one having the energy efficiency of up to 30%. We can say that today there is a lot of projects in Kazakhstan that can be implemented. What is the reason for that? We have municipal buildings with very low energy efficiency, so this is a huge amount for works in terms of new construction material or some modernization of residential sector. And in Almaty this can be residential sector, whilst in Astana the energy efficiency of municipal buildings is very low, same as any young developing capital. Huge spaces with public buildings are made, which only rarely are made in conformance with the standards. But we are forming the legislative frame implementing new standards. So in Astana, the Center for New and Green Technologies was formed, which will work as a ground for implementing all possible offers. Today, Kazakhstan is open for proposals of new projects and some interesting opportunities which can be implemented with the consideration of our specifics and our economy. Clearly, how much will it cost? Of course, for just 2 cities alone, total cost is estimated as almost $6 billion US. Out of those, it's $4 billion on Almaty and 1.5 on Astana. Quite recently there was the first session in Astana where they stated that they are waiting from Kazakhstan for some national program by which the investments will flow. So we are open for cooperation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. And I am afraid I'll disappoint you that you will have to speak very quickly, maybe even without any slides. Yet we will give a floor. We will give a floor to Mrs. Anna Giron, and then you will conclude. We are very interested in the vision of the Paris Agency, so please.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that we are running out of time, so I will be very short. I have no presentation. My point will be maybe slightly a bit different from what has been said, because I will talk about what is the position and how the city of Paris is addressing this question of urban energy and opportunities. So I will try to make it short. First point, I will maybe remind you what I said this morning. I said that we have voted a strategic action plan with carbon neutrality by the year 2050. which means 100% renewable energy and zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050. So this means if we are talking about opportunities, the first point will be collaboration and cooperation with other partners. This means that if we are talking about opportunities, economical opportunities, it means that if we want to reach this carbon neutral and 100% renewable energy, we have to collaborate with other territories and with other activities. If we say 100% renewable energy by 2050, it means that we will produce 20% in Paris. We have to find the rest outside Paris. So this means that by now we have to find the new financial mechanism, new financial and partnerships, so we can build renewable energy for resources outside Paris that will help us to reach this objective. Same thing for greenhouse gas emission. If we know that we will not reach 100% reduction by the year 2050, just ourselves. We can reach 80%, but we have to find the rest, 20%. So for this 20%, we have to find the way to have project for compensation. So where can we invest? How can we invest in project outside Paris, which will help us to reach this 20%. And this is very difficult. So if we want to have this by the year 2050, we have to start now. That means that, for example, we are working with new financial tools like green bonds, like financial funds for compensation. And we know that already banks and even citizens have money and they want to invest in real projects and projects which have sense in climate change. So this is the kind of things we are working at the moment in order to step by step go forwards 2050. So first point, collaboration, cooperation with other territories and other partners. Second, if I may, I will say just 3 points. Second points will be building sectors. For us, as we know that 90% of our buildings are already built and will be there in mid-century. So that means that we have to renovate those buildings. We know that we have to renovate 1 million dwellings by this mid-century. So that means that we have to accelerate by 25 the rate, the speed of the renovation. So this is not possible to do with the same story as in the previous century. We have to find something different. New technology, new job, new financial means, new competencies, and new way to work, new governance. This is one of our main tasks, and we are conducting, as our agency, this main subject. But this will create jobs, will give value also to the patrimony of the people that will accept to invest in this subject. So we believe that this is a good investment. And the third point will be is also energy savings. In Paris, we can consider we have almost 50,000 people suffering from fuel poverty. This means that people that cannot pay their invoice, their bill for energy. So those people, we have to help them to better save energy, to better manage their energy bills. And this is very important if we want to embark all those people in our transitions. So this is, in short, I wanted to put on the table. I'm sorry, I know this is very short, but I will be happy to discuss this later, tomorrow or today or tomorrow. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, госпожа Жиро.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Giraud. We always tell our students about a wonderful system of centralized water supply in Paris, which has been working for quite a while, and it's quite powerful. And Moscow also wants to make such system, but we will just follow Paris' example. Thank you very much. Mikhailovich, we already got in the time of the following section, so you understand it yourself. Yes, I do understand it. Thank you. Still, you let me show my slides, so I'll run through them. The work was carried out to implement the legislative package of documents developed by the government in the course of a preparation for a Paris agreement for the improvement of the system of regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. This is the package of documents. You can see it on this slide, and mainly we have a very clear roadmap as to how we're going to ratify this Paris Agreement. You can see the packs of legislative documents which we were guided by. What were our objectives? The objectives were to assess the adjustment, adaptation of fuel and energy complex to the upcoming measures. You have to understand that fuel and energy complex in Russia is a very complicated and extensive structure. Many of the facilities serve city-forming functions, and with the average temperature of the country being -5 degrees, we must heat ourselves. And obviously, the energy system is the blood vessel system of any state. So the question was, how are we going to adapt ourselves to the upcoming challenges? And we can see quite a lot of challenges. For instance, those which were developed by Rossgidromet, the information which shows that our climate is changing indeed. Not only showing that we feel warmer inside the territory of Russia, but also there is an increase of hazardous hydrometeorological phenomena, and there is clear statistics on the number of such phenomena and on when they occur and on the fact that they grow. And climate change is very good for the energy sector. You can see that the heating season is shortened, which involves huge saving of resources. There was a task to analyze all these effects. We've used this matrix approach. Here on the example of the Ural Federal District, you can see possible impact of climate change and the effects which it can cause to different industries, positive or negative. So I am trying to be really fast. So apart from analysis of such impacts, we've made the assessment of vulnerability of different sectors to climate change. This assessment was done on the basis of methodics of Intergovernmental Group on Climate Change. You can see the time period which we looked at for such assessments and the vulnerability of different types of economic activities. For instance, oil and gas sector. Next, when we know about vulnerability, we offered adaptation, ways of adaptation. Here, possible way of adaptation to the observed changes was power supply lines. As I said, we've considered all elements of fuel and power complex, and in particular for the power supply line, the expected action and ways of adaptation are listed in this table, in this matrix. Besides, it was mentioned here a lot that best available technologies exist, and there is a list of such technologies and projects are developed, and my colleagues know it perfectly well. I can say that in the 7th National Statement of the Russian Federation on Climate Change, which was already presented to the Federation Council, there were some options listed of the best available technologies implemented in Russia. The Ministry of Economy developed a special list which includes over 80 available best technologies. So everything which is offered here is included in that guidance. And finally, if we speak about main conclusions, which I don't have the time to read, I'd like to say that probably the most important thing about these aspects is the fact that the changes express themselves heterogeneously in the territory of the country, and mainly the measures of adaptation to be applied are the methods of structural innovations and solutions which already exist. Most likely, we must define a certain region, find out what are the unfavorable adverse phenomena occurring in that territory, and offer a measure from the list of adaptation. Still, another important thing is updating the map of meteorological division and use the method which is already used for designing and updating of the fuel and energy facilities, because indeed we have to prepare ourselves to the conditions which we see today.
Thank you very much. Sorry for this attempt to interrupt. Okay, dear colleagues, I want to thank everyone for sharing such a diverse experience and dynamic experience. And I want to draw attention to certain nuance. And we had different interpreters interpreting, and I want to thank them. And some interpreter interpreted best available techniques as best available techniques, and best. The other one did best available practices. So you see, it's a matter of words, but the difference is huge, and it plays a key role in having proper understanding. So the next session will be here on renewables. Please stay with us, and I want to thank our speakers. I forgot the French word for it, but merci beaucoup. Right, Ms. Joel.